Welcome to The Secret Case. Today we will explore one of the most macabre cases in American criminal history, that of Gary Heidnik, also known as the baby planter. This man, whose life was marked by isolation, manipulation, and violence, perpetrated some of the most shocking crimes ever recorded. His story is filled with horror, psychological trauma, and a twisted plan that defies all understanding. Before we begin, I would like to remind you that 95% of the people who watch our videos are not subscribers. If you enjoy this content and want to stay up to date with the most shocking cases of crime, be sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Don't miss any in-depth analysis. Gary Michael Heidnik was born on November 31, 1943 in Eastlake, Ohio. From his early childhood, his life was marked by pain and abuse. His parents separated when he was only 2 years old, and from then on, Heidnik lived with his father, a man known for being extremely harsh and abusive. Heidnik did not have an easy childhood. He was a withdrawn child who felt constantly ashamed of his incontinence. His father ridiculed him and punished him cruelly, often displaying wet sheets in the windows of his house for the neighbors to see. This environment of abuse, coupled with his social isolation, began to shape Heidnik's disturbed psyche. Despite all this, Gary was an exceptionally intelligent child. At just a few years old, his IQ was recorded as 148, which placed him in the genius range. However, his intelligence did not prevent him from being a lonely child, bullied by his peers and despised at home. These early experiences laid the groundwork for the horrific acts he would commit years later. After dropping out of high school, Heidnik enlisted in the U.S. Army, which seemed to offer him a way out of his tortured life. However, his time in the military was not a path to redemption. During his training, he began to show signs of mental destabilization, and in 1962 he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. This diagnosis marked the beginning of a further decline in his mental health. He was discharged from the military on a disability pension, and upon his return to civilian life, his behavior became increasingly erratic and disruptive. Heidnik was admitted to several psychiatric institutions, but never received adequate treatment for his illness. During these years, he also developed a fascination with poor women, particularly those who suffered from mental disabilities. His fixation on controlling and manipulating these women was a trait that would only intensify over time. In 1971, Gary Heidnik founded what he called the Unification Church of God Ministries. Although the name of the church sounded legitimate, it was actually just a front for his illegal activities. He used the church to hide his earnings and manipulate the people around him, amassing a small fortune illicitly. As his mental health deteriorated, Heidnik began to conceive even darker plans. In his twisted mind, he believed that he must create a super race of children, and that the women he would kidnap would be the ones to bring these children into the world. His obsession with this concept led him to commit acts of unimaginable violence. Between 1976 and 1986, Heidnik was arrested several times for sexual assault and kidnapping. But his most infamous and terrifying crime was yet to come. On November 5, 1986, Heidnik set his macabre plan in motion. Over a period of several months, he kidnapped 6 African American women, all from vulnerable backgrounds and some with mental disabilities. He held them captive in his basement, where he subjected them to horrific abuse and torture. The women were chained, kept in inhumane conditions, and forced to endure a regime of terror and constant suffering. Heidnik tortured them physically and psychologically, punishing them brutally whenever they resisted his orders. His goal, in his own words, was to turn these women into incubators to give birth to the children he desired. One of the darkest aspects of their case is the fact that Heidnik not only tortured these women, but also inflicted psychological damage on them by pitting them against each other. In an attempt to break their will, he forced them to punish the other captives under threat of death, creating an atmosphere of distrust and despair. The women, trapped in this nightmare, were forced to compete for the meager food Heidnik provided them and for the slimmest chance of survival. This macabre game not only sought their obedience, but also to dehumanize them to the extreme. The conditions he subjected his victims to were appalling. Not only did he repeatedly beat and rape them, but he also starved them, tortured them with electricity, and immersed them in pits filled with water and excrement. Heidnik seemed to enjoy the control he exerted over his prisoners and the utter despair he drove them into. Finally, on March 25, 1987, one of his victims, Josefina Rivera, managed to escape. Rivera had been kidnapped and held captive for months, but she managed to gain Heidnik's trust, convincing him that she would be his ally. Once free, she contacted the police and led authorities to Heidnik's home, where they discovered unimaginable horror in his basement. When police officers entered the home, they found the women chained and in deplorable conditions. The basement, which Heidnik had turned into his personal dungeon, was filled with incriminating evidence detailing the horrendous crimes he had committed. The discovery shocked the entire community and the entire country, who were shocked by the magnitude of the horror Heidnik had perpetrated. Gary Heidnik's trial began shortly after his arrest, and the case quickly gained media attention. The disturbing details that came to light during the trial were enough to horrify anyone. During the proceedings, Heidnik's defense attempted to plead insanity, arguing that he suffered from a severe mental illness that had driven him to commit these heinous acts. The jury, however, showed no sympathy for Heidnik. The evidence was compelling, and the testimony of the surviving victims was harrowing. The women who managed to survive testified at the trial, describing in detail the months of torture and abuse they were subjected to. Finally, in 1988, Gary Heidnik was sentenced to death for the crimes he had committed. He was sentenced to die by lethal injection, and his execution was scheduled for 2019. However, his execution brought no comfort to the victims and their families, who were still dealing with the after effects of the trauma Heidnik had inflicted on them. On July 6, 2019, Gary Heidnik was finally executed by lethal injection. His death marked the closing of one of the darkest chapters in American criminal history. Although his execution ended his life, the scars he left on his victims and society will remain deep. Throughout his life, Heidnik had proven himself to be an extremely manipulative man, capable of committing heinous acts without remorse. His case served as a grim warning of the dangers of extreme violence and how legal and social systems can fail to detect dangerous individuals before they commit horrific crimes. However, Gary Heidnik's story is also a reminder of the importance of listening to and protecting the most vulnerable people in our society. His victims were marginalized women, many of them mentally disabled, who were caught in a cycle of abuse without being able to defend themselves. The fact that Heidnik was able to hold these women captive for so long without being discovered raises troubling questions about the system's ability to protect those who are in extreme risk situations. The case of Gary Heidnik is undoubtedly one of the most chilling and disturbing in American criminal history. The brutality and sadism with which Heidnik treated his victims continues to resonate in the collective memory, and his name has become synonymous with horror and evil. However, we must also remember the victims who suffered at the hands of this monster, as well as the bravery of those who survived and helped bring him to justice. This case invites us to reflect on the challenges we face as a society when it comes to identifying and preventing extreme violence. Although Gary Heidnik has been executed, his dark legacy persists, and his story will remain a reminder of the depths to which human cruelty can reach. If you've been as shocked by this case as we have been, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and share it with anyone you think would be interested in learning more about the most disturbing cases in criminal history. Also, make sure to subscribe to The Secret Case and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our analysis.